Hi, I hope all is well. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to speak with me. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity. As you can see here, I am Robert Parrillo. I prefer to go by Bob. If you have a way you like to be addressed, just please let me know. This is my presentation. A good place to start with any presentation is with an introduction. Today we will discuss the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos case study, which you are well aware. There's also another person involved. I believe his name was Ramesh Bilwani, went by Sunny. But I will focus on Elizabeth Holmes. Many of the issues would be the same regardless. To begin, I would like to point out that any fact pattern can give rise to a host of legal and ethical issues that can be difficult to untangle, but also interesting, and that I hope that is true here. We know that Elizabeth Holmes did some things wrong, right, for sure. So what we want to do here is think about what and why and what should be the consequences. And this is a timely case study also because there's ongoing criminal charges and a recent HBO documentary, which some of you may have seen. Now, I'm going to take a big picture approach, present a bunch of questions, which I hope are interesting, and use this case study as a way to introduce some core legal and ethical concepts. We won't cover every possible issue, unfortunately, that may arise from this fact pattern, but hopefully we'll cover a lot of interesting ground in under 30 minutes. Now, our agenda is as follows. We will first look at what happened, right? What happened? What did Elizabeth Holmes do that got everyone so upset? Second, we are going to briefly discuss three different types of liability or responsibility, and I will use those terms interchangeably. We will talk about tort liability first, then criminal liability, and finally professional liability. Now, admittedly, these doctrines can be nuanced and complicated. For the sake of clarity and usefulness, we will try to simplify them and put them into some context, right? Context is important. In part, we would like to learn how the same actions might lead to different legal, professional, and ethical consequences. For example, something may be a crime, but not what we call a tort, or something may be a tort, but not serious enough to be a crime. Or some behavior might trigger professional liability, like having your professional license suspended, or not being allowed to act in some professional capacity for some period of time, but not rise to the level of a tort or a crime. Also, we will try to keep in mind the different purposes associated with the different types of liability, because that may help us understand why we have one type of liability but not another. Finally, I will present a bunch of additional questions to see whether we think Elizabeth Holmes should be liable for a crime, for a tort, and or professional/ethical liability. Admittedly, we already know some of what Elizabeth Holmes has been liable for, or admitted liability to. We will suspend some of our prior knowledge so that we can adequately address the legal and ethical issues. Honestly, in my opinion, in learning these issues, the result or what actually happened is much, much less important than understanding how we got there. Now let's look at some of the specifics of our case study. We want to think about what happened. Why are we so upset? And in the background, I think it is interesting to think about whether this was all just business as usual. So basically, let's consider what happened here. If I were teaching a full class, I would ask students to summarize what happened. Here, I will do it for you. In order to understand any legal case, one of the first things you do is brief the facts or summarize the facts. The facts of this case are pretty complicated, as you can see from the fact pattern. Basically, though, to make things simple, we can summarize the facts as follows. Lies, lies, and lies. Lies, lies, and lies. And more lies, lies, and lies. All kidding aside, although the facts are complex, basically we have Elizabeth Holmes, through some would say charm and charisma, family and elite insider connections, or maybe even blissful ignorance on part of investors, lied her way to a multi-billion-dollar valuation based on a revolutionary blood test that never really worked. And a lot of people relied on her lies and lost a lot of money. Now let's talk a little bit more about lying, right? What's wrong with lying? Some have suggested that in Silicon Valley, there is a culture of lies in some sense, and that entrepreneurs often lie. For example, there was a recent article in Entrepreneur magazine that is called, "Should Entrepreneurs Lie?" It's a tricky question, right? Um, it is an interesting article and I would say worth a read. And now we can't really get into all these issues here, but I would say I think it's one thing to be overly optimistic about your business and puff up things a bit. It is quite another to tell bold-faced lies that are demonstrably false and can potentially harm people. Also, lying can have consequences, real, tangible consequences, not just to those being deceived, which I guess are obvious, but also to the person who lies, right? Lying can trigger tort responsibility, potentially criminal responsibility, and ethical or professional responsibility. And that is what we are interested in here. Now let's briefly discuss tort liability. I know it's a funny sounding word, tort. If I had more time or if this was teaching a full class, I would ask students, have they ever heard of the term tort and what does it mean? Now there are technical definitions of a tort and specific elements for each and every tort. That's not necessarily what we're concerned about here. Basically, a tort is where someone is harmed by someone else, and the person harmed is seeking compensation for those harms other than under contract. As a side note, there are clearly contract issues here as well, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to focus on those here, just because we don't have the time. So now back to tort law. Actually, the root of the word tort, it's a funny sounding word, but basically comes from words that mean things like wrongs, harms, injustices, etc. Also, in tort law or under tort law, the harm can be intentional or caused by someone just acting poorly, which we usually call negligence. So that's basically it, but there's more to it, but I think that's basically true. So when we think about the Elizabeth Holmes situation, we must remember that in order to recover under tort, for someone to be liable, it doesn't matter whether she did something intentionally wrong or she just acted poorly, right? Although I think it's probably clear, at least from the facts as I understand them, that there was probably a lot of intent here. Now, the primary purpose of tort law is usually to compensate victims for those harms, or what you see on this slide, right? Money, cold hard cash. It's sort of a separate discussion to think about this adequately compensate victims, but that's usually the way we do it. Now, the harm can be physical, it can be emotional, it may be economic, or even a bit wilder. Nevertheless, the mantra, no harm, no foul, usually holds true. In other words, no harm, which is what tort really means, no tort, none of this, no money. Again, if we had more time or if I was teaching a full class, I would ask, can anyone think of examples of a tort, or in other words, where one person sues another person for harms that that other person caused? Examples might include things like medical malpractice, right? A doctor messes up, injures a patient, the patient sues to recover damages for their harms. A car accident, perhaps someone is going too fast, right? And they injure you, you sue to recover damages, what are called slip and fall cases, like there's a puddle of water in a restaurant, right? Somebody spilled it and they didn't have a reasonable time to clean it up. That might be a situation. Also harms to your pocketbook, like fraud, which is what we potentially have here in the Elizabeth Holmes case. And there are even some more exotic type torts like harms to your privacy. So ultimately, in tort law, what we have is a situation where someone is harmed or wronged, right, by someone else, and we're going to compensate or try to compensate the injured party for that harm, usually with money damages. Again, with the Elizabeth Holmes situation, one of the important things to consider is whether and how people were harmed, right? We have to look at the harm for tort purposes, right? There has to be a harm, and how can we compensate them with money? Now, this concludes our very brief introduction to torts. The discussion was made a bit simplistic, but hopefully gave you a good idea of what a tort is and the purposes of tort law. Now, we will come back to this again in a moment. Now, the second type of liability that could be relevant in the Elizabeth Holmes situation, which is, and we'll talk about that more when we get at the end of the discussion, that would be criminal liability. Perhaps one of the biggest distinctions between a tort and criminal liability is that the primary purpose of criminal laws are to protect society and public interest and not necessarily compensate victims for harms, which would be the case in a tort situation. In fact, many definitions of a crime define it as a breach of a duty or obligation owed to society. Not an obligation owed to me, right, or to you personally, like would be important and critical to understand under tort law and in a tort case. So ultimately, it is not the specific individual harmed who is really being protected in a criminal case, but rather it is society and public interest as a whole that we are trying to protect. Thus, when we consider the Elizabeth Holmes situation for purposes of criminal law, we need to think about how society and public interests, right? Society and public interests are hurt. Also, because of criminal law's purpose of protecting society and the public interest, interestingly, you can have a crime where no one is in fact directly harmed, right? And this is much, much different than in tort, which requires harm, because in some sense, that's what tort literally means. Thus, in the Elizabeth Holmes case, it is possible for her behavior to be a crime regardless of whether individuals were harmed, which would be a critical consideration in a tort case. Now, this may be difficult to understand, and if I had more time or this was a full class, I would ask, can anyone think of such a crime? A crime where no one is in fact harmed, but it is a crime because someone could have been harmed, or public safety, I should say, or public interest was at stake, right? And this is relevant in the Elizabeth Holmes case as well. But let me give you a generic example. Might be there's sort of what we call inchoate or incomplete or attempted crimes. For example, you are angry at your neighbor. You draw up intricate plans to beat up and rob them. Hopefully you don't really do that. And you enlist some other people to help you. You are caught before your neighbor is actually hurt, or before they were even aware about what you were doing. Now, this can be a crime because there is a real societal interest in preventing and discouraging such behavior. However, right, since your neighbor was not in fact hurt in any way, he can't sue you for money damages, right, in tort, right, as you call no harm, no foul, no money, right? So thus, no tort. Now, if you look at some of the criminal charges against Holmes, you got crimes, just like the example above, like conspiracy, right, which does not require that the crime actually took place, right, that in our example, just a second ago, that people were actually harmed. You could still have a conspiracy, a crime without that, because what we're trying to protect is the public or societal interest. Now, the final distinction that we will make, I'm trying to get into the weeds too much, but I think this is important to consider, is that in criminal liability and tort liability is to think about what is at stake for the person accused. Now, in a tort case, it's usually money. In a criminal case, it can be much more severe and include taking away your liberty, put you in prison, or even in really serious circumstances, sacrificing or taking away your life. This might lead you, if you were astute, to ask, based on the same facts, is it easier to find someone liable for a tort or guilty of crime? Right? Even with Elizabeth Holmes, is it easier, do we think, to find her guilty of a crime or is it easier to find her liable under a tort, right? Or if you think it this way, should it be easier to take away someone's money, right, to compensate for a harm, or to put someone in jail for the same behavior? If I was again in a class, I would ask that and see what students have to say. But generally, if you think about it, we make it easier to take away their money. That is one reason why we have different, often called standards of proof, in a tort case than in a criminal case. Usually, it is supposed to be harder to put someone in jail, right? A higher standard of proof for a crime than to make them pay compensation for a tort based on the same fact pattern, which we'll see in a moment. Just because Elizabeth Holmes may have settled tort cases, right, or even if she was found liable in a tort case, it doesn't necessarily mean she would be found guilty or not guilty or vice versa or to settle the criminal charges. Also, I am sure many of us can think of other high-profile cases where a lot of this was in play, right? A situation where a person is found, let's say, not guilty for a crime, right? Like maybe like even a serious crime like murder, then based on the same facts found liable in a tort case and required to pay the victims money damages, right? So that the important point is, and I do find standards of proof interesting, but I can tell you why you can have, based on the same fact pattern, different results in a criminal charge as opposed to a tort charge. Now, this concludes our brief introduction to criminal law. Hopefully we have a better understanding of what a crime is and how it might be different than a tort. Now, the final type of liability or responsibility that we will discuss is professional, or sometimes also called ethical liability or responsibility. Also, we only talk about it in general terms, acknowledging that there can be variations between professions. Nevertheless, I think the general points can be pretty useful. Here we often have a state board, some administrative agency, some self-regulatory group, or some similar body or regulating professional. They regulate professional practice, and they may seek sanctions for unethical behavior. Now, these sanctions may include things like losing your license, being suspended, or being prevented from engaging in certain professional or business practices. Now, all sorts of professions have ethical requirements. This includes doctors, lawyers, right? And although lawyers get a bad rap, there are some serious ethical requirements and consequences for violating those consequences, which is true of accountants. Business owners, CEOs can be liable for professional sanctions in different ways. Professional sports players, professional sport teams owners, etc. Also, although not necessarily, what constitutes unethical behavior for purposes of professional responsibility is very often written down in some sort of ethical code or even sometimes in the law. Now, the primary purpose here is similar to criminal liability. We are concerned with public safety, public interest, and in many ways, even public trust in the profession. Also, it is important to point out that behavior may not be a crime or a tort, but still trigger professional sanctions, right? For example, as we'll see in a moment, it is possible for Elizabeth Holmes to receive some sort of professional sanction, but not be criminally liable, etc. Now, professional liability is usually couched in terms of character and fitness to practice a particular profession. Also, although I can't get into all of it here, the behavior that may lead to the professional sanction may not be at all related to your particular practice or potential practice in that profession. For example, if Elizabeth Holmes someday wanted to practice law, the lies she told could prevent her from getting or delay her getting a law license or other professional license. Now, this may be contrary to some people's opinion about attorneys, that maybe lies, are their trade. I would disagree with that totally. And, they do have, like many other professions, a very serious code of ethics. Last, I would like to address standards of proof in professional liability cases. Now, these are generalizations, and it could be nuanced and complicated. I'm just sort of thinking what I think is the most useful way to think about it. It is usually easier to find professional liability than criminal liability, right? In other words, it is usually easier to take away your ability to practice a profession than to put you in jail for the similar behavior, right? Because putting you in jail in many ways is a much more serious consequence, right? In other words, it would usually be easier to prevent, let's say, Elizabeth Holmes from engaging in a profession like being a director or a CEO than it would be to put her in jail. Also, it often requires more evidence, right? I say a higher standard of proof, not always, but this is the way I think is useful to think about it. A higher standard of proof to take away a license or to prevent someone from engaging in professional practice than to pursue a tort case against them. Part of the reasoning may be that it should be easier to take away some of your money in a tort case to compensate someone harmed rather than take away your ability to make money, right, or your whole livelihood. In other words, it is probably easier to require Elizabeth Holmes to compensate tort victims than to prevent her from doing business. Actually, again, it's much more complicated than that, but I think it's generally true, and I think it's a good, interesting way to introduce standards of proof. Ultimately, anything that puts the public or could put the public at risk or puts the profession in a bad light is grounds for professional sanction, and it does not matter whether the behavior was a crime or a tort. Now, we could discuss all of this a lot more, but I think this gives you a good introduction to professional or ethical responsibility. Now, I would like to further consider the consequences and potential consequences of the lies told by Elizabeth Holmes. If this were an actual class I was teaching, I might break students up into groups and have them discuss the issues themselves and then come together and discuss them as a class and see what we've learned. But we don't have time to do this. Also, I think one of the benefits to using case studies like we have here is that you can ask a bunch of questions and manipulate the fact pattern to get students hopefully to think deeply. Now, here are some additional questions that we might ask students to grapple with or grapple with ourselves. And some of this we've talked about in passing, but I'm going to try to bring it together a bit. What kind of liability is triggered, right? What kind of liability is triggered? Do we think that Elizabeth Holmes should be liable for a crime, right? There's a level of rise to that, to things that we talked about for criminal behavior, violating the public interest, etc. For a tort, right, were people harmed? Can we compensate them with money damages? Or should there be some sort of professional sanction? Now, I've talked about some of this as we've been going along, and here I think these are probably summary type questions I would ask students at the end of a lesson, but I'll briefly give you my 2 cents. Also, we should really think about not only what actually happened, which we know because hindsight is 20/20, but I think that's the least interesting thing. I think it's better to think about the issues anew, but also we should think about what happened and still can happen, right? And keep in mind the different purposes and the different types of liability. My 2 cents as for tort, remember we're basically trying to compensate victims from harms they received because of someone else's either negligent bad behavior or intentional bad behavior. Here we have people that we know were harmed. They relied on Elizabeth Holmes's lies. And again, hindsight is 20/20. We know, in fact, that there have been tort settlements from investors on these very issues. As for crimes, as I said, the purpose is not generally just to compensate victims, but to protect society and public interest. In fact, as I've already said, many definitions of a crime define it as a breach of a duty owed or an obligation owed to society. Here, I would think that Elizabeth Holmes' lies would or certainly could probably arise to this level. And again, we know from the facts that federal authorities have accused her of multiple counts of what they would call massive fraud. She's pleaded not guilty and is currently awaiting trial, as I understand it. These are really serious, though, because if convicted, she could face up to a couple decades in prison. Now, as for professional responsibility, we need to think about whether her behavior is of the type that puts the public at risk or that stains the reputation of the investment industry. I think that it does. Also, again, we know that she has in fact suffered some sort of professional sanctions. The Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, has basically disbarred her for a decade, right? So I believe she can't serve as an officer or director, maybe among other things, of a public company for a decade, for 10 years. I would argue that if you look at the mission of the SEC, we're not going to go into all the practice of the SEC, but if you look at the mission of the SEC and you read it, part of its role is to promote professional responsibility. That would be my take. Actually, part of the SEC's mission specifically states the SEC strives to promote a market environment that is worthy of the public trusts, right? Worthy of, the public's trust. So the idea of weakening public trust is often an essential issue in professional liability matters. I think we certainly have that here. Now, here are some other questions to think about. Does it matter if the victims were partially at fault? No due diligence, greed, willful ignorance, right? If you consider tort, in some ways this might matter. For example, the purpose of tort law is to compensate victims, and if they are part at fault, I would say they shouldn't be fully compensated, right? But it would be more complicated in a criminal or professional liability case because we don't want to blame victims. Also, the purpose of criminal law and professional liability are much more different, like I said, than tort law. In short, I would say that victims' culpability could matter in tort cases, or any tort case, like the ones against Elizabeth Holmes, but less in all in a criminal or professional liability situation. Another sort of related question, if she's finding liability in a tort case or settles a tort case, does that mean she could also be liable criminally or professionally? Again, not necessarily. These things are different. They have different burdens of proof, right? Recall, like I said before, there are different standards in a criminal case and a professional case, so not necessarily. This is, again, why, based on the same fact pattern, someone can be found not guilty for a crime, but then later successfully sued for money damages for harms that they caused. Again, there are even more questions this fact pattern can engender, right? Does it matter whether people are actually harmed, all right? Or does it matter whether the victims wish to cooperate? Let's say everything in the end worked out, right? She lied, but somehow she made money, right? In tort law, I would say that it does matter because the primary purpose is to compensate victims. If victims weren't harmed, then no tort. But in criminal liability, in criminal or professional situations, again, it wouldn't matter as much because what you're trying to do is protect society and the industry, confidence in the industry in general. Now, I can go on and on and on and look at these questions, but I think they're very interesting to consider, and in a real live classroom setting, hopefully it would engender discussion. Now, I have really just some final thoughts here, so I can get in under 30 minutes. Is ethical responsibility different from professional liability, right? Or professional responsibility? We've talked as if they were the same, but you need to think about, is that really the case, right? Is professional responsibility, which is often codified in some way, an ethical code, etc., is that the same as professional responsibility? Or can ethical responsibility in any way conflict with your obligations under criminal law, professional law, or tort responsibility, right? And these are not easy questions to answer. I think a lot of it would depend on how you viewed ethics. My final thought is, I think perhaps the most important thing, to say thank you. In conclusion, in this teaching presentation, I've tried to give you a good idea how I might teach a specific subject. Specifically, we've used Elizabeth Holmes' case study to introduce criminal law, tort law, and professional responsibility. Again, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. If you would ever want to get in contact with me, I can be reached at professor.robert.p@gmail.com. I'm also available on LinkedIn. So again, thank you.